Welcome to Surfacing. In this episode, hosts Lisa Welchman and Andy Vitale speak to Katherine Benjamin. Katherine is the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Digital Services at the City of New York. Katherine spoke about the challenges and triumphs of service design during the COVID-19 pandemic and offered her insights on the history and future of digital government.
Super excited, as you know, because we talked a little bit beforehand about having this conversation, which is a conversation, honestly, I would love to be having in a restaurant over several hours in some great city with some beverages and many courses of food. It's been such a long time since I've seen you, and everything seems longer with the pandemic. So thank you so much for joining Andy and I on this podcast. We've got way too many questions to ask you. You have such an amazing and interesting background that it's going to be hard to narrow it down, but we've skinnied it down to a few starter questions. So I'm going to hand things over to Andy to get started.
Can I be awkward for just 1 second?
Of course you can.
Yeah.
I just need to fangirl really hard. So Andy, it's so nice to meet you, but Lisa, when I read her book, I don't even know this is relevant to the podcast, but I just need to say, when I read her book, it was like every frustrating, difficult meeting I've had or something that I thought was unique to the project I was working on. Suddenly I was like, oh, there's a whole book written about exactly the challenges I'm seeing. So I'm very excited to be here and any opportunity to chat with you all because, I think, in the government space, it's very similar. You'd be surprised to learn it's very similar to what's happening in big organizations. So I am excited for this. And also I'll let you know that you might hear a cat named Humphrey in the background. He likes to jump in and say hello sometimes. So that's enough awkwardness for me.
That's awesome. No, and you might hear my dog too, who's sleeping. And at some point he'll get up. He's never up with me. He's always downstairs.
Aww.
Yeah, so.
Which one? Is it Geraldo Rivera who likes you?
Geraldo Rivera likes me. And Gringo is he's indifferent. So no, Katherine, it's great to meet you. And so thanks for coming on. And one of the things that we like to start with is just to let everybody know who might not know who you are, a little bit about you and your journey that got you to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Humphrey, stay away from my water. Hello, Katherine Benjamin here. Currently, I'm serving as the Deputy CTO for Digital Services at the New York City Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer. But I come to government digital things by way of actually government healthcare digital things. So I started in the non-digital space and was working in a frontline role in a National Health Service hospital, Homerton University Hospital in East London, if anyone's been there or lives in Hackney in that area. And through my frontline work where I was doing outreach with people with complex needs, often, in the middle of the night or at what they would call antisocial times of day, and getting to know members of the communities and try to bring them into services, one can't help but think, there are places where sensible and appropriate uses of technology would actually really help this. And so I ended up then working at NHS England, which is the central commissioning body for health services in the United Kingdom, working on their digital portfolio. And what my contribution there originally was trying to bring that user-centered angle, not necessarily from a design perspective, because that wasn't my background, but from that firsthand experience I had working with patients and understanding where they're sort of getting stuck in the system. And so I continued in that space. And of course, as a Canadian or someone working in the UK, digital healthcare is very adjacent to digital government because the healthcare system is part of the government system. And so I sort of made that natural transition. So I've also worked in the Ontario Cabinet Office for the Ontario Digital Service. And also worked a little bit in startups at private companies that do digital healthcare. But now I'm back in the government scene in the United States.
I got to work in healthcare for a few years in my career, and it was such rewarding work. So being able to create these services that actually help people and identify opportunities to really drive things forward for people is so great and rewarding. So that was all I wanted to add, Lisa. I know you have a question that will spark more.
No. It's all good. There's so many things to ask, but one of the things I want to make sure that I ask, and it's a little bit self-serving because I care about it a lot, was, that consolidation of websites in the UK. When we were talking at some other point in the recent past, we brought this up, which was, you were involved in that consolidation that was maybe 20 years ago, started maybe 20 years ago, which is kind of amazing. I remember I had a lot of U.S. federal government clients at the time. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but my fast perception of what was going on at that time was that the UK decided to get rid of all of this cacophony of websites with a different sense of workflow and design or whatever and consolidate everything down. It was an aggressive move, right? And I even wrote about it. I think I was a blog post called like The Second Revolution. And I was praising it because I thought that was really amazing. This was before US had a digital office. There was nothing like that at the time. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about that experience and what you did in it and also reflect a little bit because 20 years have passed, right? And I would say that governments that I look at who made those types of choices are more successful in service design and more successful in supporting its citizens. But that's just my opinion. So
yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, because I think that's a really important thing, particularly with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And being able to communicate to people effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about this topic because I think it's really fascinating. When we talk, just before we talk a bit about that process, I think if people aren't familiar with digital government, one of the things, there's a lot of sayings in digital government. I've got a stack of stickers over there that I should have brought handy that have some of our slogans on it, the sort of rally cries, the digital government movement. But one of the more common ones is that a person shouldn't have to have an org chart for government to understand how to negotiate a service. And as many people know all around the world, universally true if you say, have you had a frustrating experience or have you been confused? Like that's extremely common. Most people, I think, have had that. And so what started happening in the UK, I sort of was just entering the digital government scene after a huge wave of success in terms of this consolidation had occurred. So basically, yeah, you're exactly right that this was part of what the Government Digital Service in the UK, also known as gov.uk, was championing. It came off the back of it used to be called DirectGov. And so there's just a series of lots of websites. And there was a moment in time where there was a huge amount of top-down political support where all of the sort of decision makers, that's actually entirely untrue. I was going to say all the decision makers were aligned. There's no universe where all the decision makers are ever aligned, but enough decision makers were aligned that it was decided that having distinct look and feels for different branches of government, where because it's very common that you have to go through, several branches or ministries or departments, whatever you call it, that all of those disjointed look and feels and service patterns were, befuddling people, and arguably are quite costly to maintain, because you're having to build, design libraries for each of these things over and over. And so it was decided in the UK there will be 2, or technically 3, depending on how you want to divide things, websites. Anything that's about government services will be on the gov.uk platform, and anything that's about health services that's resident or citizen facing will be on the nhs.uk platform. And then they also had this thing with Public Health England, which was for health professionals. So we'll put that aside for one moment. So I worked on the nhs.uk platform, and at the time it was called NHS Choices, but now it's sort of rebranded to nhs.uk, and I worked on, it was part of the Alpha team doing a bit of that transition. And absolutely that was, one of the things that was at the forefront of people's mind was this recognition that people are getting lost within very, very big bureaucracies. And so it definitely was tense. And when you talk to different governments, if they've looked at this approach, maybe haven't done it themselves, a lot of people don't love it who own different websites, because they think this means I don't get my own look and feel. This means that I don't get to custom brand my thingamajig. That means that this vision I had for this grand launch of whatever is going to be harder to market because you're really stuck with one set of designs and one set of service patterns. I think there's a lot of pros to it. For one is if you're trying to be a small or medium-sized business trying to get into working with government, when they publish all of those things online, it's very clear sort of the parameters with which you'll be designing. And for all of us who've worked in, different fragments of government, it's not uncommon that you come into a service and you're like, do you have existing design templates? And none of these things exist. So you're sort of having to jig a sort of cohesive experience together. So I'm actually surprised it hasn't been replicated more. I know that it cost a lot of people a lot of political capital to push for that, because it means they consolidated, I believe it was more than 800 websites into gov.uk.
Yeah, it was an insane number. I remember seeing that and going like, wow, that's a lot of force. I mean, when I hear you tell this story, it just, maybe I'm naive, but to me, it sounds like someone decided to put the citizen first.
Yeah, I mean,
right, and not the ego of the organization or the ego of the leaders. And, I often wonder how digital makers and digital leaders, because I think it's probably more leaders than it is the actual maker level, and sometimes those are the same people, can continue to make the choice to put their desire to have the ego or reputation of their part of the business, their part of the government, above what is a comprehensive and easy to use intuitive experience for the user or for the customer. And so I often think the only excuses can be, well, we're going to get paid anyway. We're the only version of this. So where else are you going to go to file your taxes or get your health care or whatever? We don't actually have to be good. Is that cynical, do you think? I mean, you've been in environments where that's been done and where that's not been done. What do you think some of the reasons are for not getting that work done? I mean, I'm looking at it very coldly from the outside and maybe a little bit harshly as well, because I'm not in there. But is it more subtle than that?
That's a great question. I think a lot about, at one point, the Ontario government did a little bit of, it was pop-up testing, or they were on the streets in Ontario asking people, just the questions as I understand them, and I haven't seen this, I've just sort of heard the secondhand, was that they were asking people, for X service, do you know what department runs it? Because what they were trying to establish is, some things high profile tax things, everyone knows where to go. It's part of common knowledge. But there's more esoteric things that you just don't necessarily know where to go. And also ministries are often reshuffled or rebranded, or departments. And so the research basically told them, people are not aware. Unless it's one of the top 5 services in government, people don't really know where to go. And I think that's often what's lost on some folks, because they've been in government thinking about this one area, and they have a deep subject matter expertise, but they're less familiar with how you'd manage that digital presence. And so there's an assumption that, people will know where to go, or they'll know that, the point of entry is this place over here. And actually what we see is that's not always the case. Though if you wanted to, there's a similar story from the gov.uk team, and I don't know what product it was, but they described an anecdote where they were under tremendous pressure from a very executive person to put this thing that they felt was not conducive to the user journey, front and center on this homepage. And there was this whole tension about, do we put it on the homepage? Do we put it on the homepage? And the person was insisting we do it, or they do it. I was not involved. And the people designing the service were like, this adds no value to the user. And then someone on the team thought, you know what, let's just pull the analytics and let's look, is anyone actually going to the homepage? And they realized that actually the pattern was such that they completely bypassed the homepage. And so it was decided, we'll give the person the thing they want on the homepage, because actually it makes no difference to our service experience. And that was the compromise they struck. And so it's both a happy story, because everyone got what they wanted, but also it's
and sad.
We also want to move beyond that, because we want to have analytics-driven discussions. So the final thing I'll add on that is I think it's moving really fast. So that story is 7 years old. Would that happen today? I think often, Lisa, about your framework within your book of different types of digital leaders and progressive and conservative digital leaders. And I think you're seeing that sort of leadership also change because, digital is such a huge component of leadership in basically any organization at this point.
So my last follow-on before I stop hogging your time is, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to hit that dynamic any more. So just this past week, Andy and I were talking about when we're recording this is right when the U.S. is trying to figure out who's going to get the booster COVID-19 vaccine, the third one, right? And so Andy had sent me some information, and it's all over the news of just sort of like the flip-flopping, and CDC says this, and is it Food and Drug Administration says something else, and the president says that, or whatever, and there's a lot of confusion about what that may be. And I dropped him a link to the Dutch. I just moved to the Netherlands, to the Dutch COVID vaccination dashboard, which is elegant and well populated and organized. Smaller country, lots of different reasons why those things can be the same. But it seems like a lot of things online, not everything in the Dutch government are highly organized, but it seems like this is COVID-19 pandemic presents an opportunity and a use case, right, that could show governments how important it is to actually present information in a comprehensive, consolidated way, to share across departmental information and data sets as well. Do you, from the position of where you are, just sort of in the know, talking to other leaders in government, do you think that people are taking some of that lesson from this, or are they still just sort of trying to tread water and keep their heads above water with all the information around the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And at the Forward 50 conference in November of 2020, Alistair Kroll, who's the author of Lean Analytics, had a tweet. It was sort of a provocation. And he said, something to the effect of, government is really a big tech company, but sometimes they just don't know it yet. And what he was referring to is that, yes, almost overnight, many government services, nobody could see my air quotes there, but there was government services, become digital government services overnight. But of course, those of us who work in this space know that how you manage that is like quite different. And so I think that has resonated, that people see the appetite and that this is the direction that it's going. I think depending on where you look in the global digital government movements, and I say movements plural with an S because not everyone follows the same process and is at different stages. And some, governments are really, really doubling down on that. And you see that in the hiring. If you look at things like the Biden administration has really focused on things like 18F and the Technology Transformation Service, like they're really going for this. And then I think others, especially some of the smaller governments that just don't have enough staff to create, just in terms of sheer headcount alone, if you're a very small government, you might not have that organic movement of people within the government saying, no, this is the way we need to sort of start thinking more about a product management culture and start thinking about our services as a multi-channel experience, and for thinking about the background of many of the people who are working in the public service. They're often incredibly sophisticated subject matter experts. But if you're an epidemiologist, and we saw this a lot in the NHS, you might have 20 years of experience and 1,000 publications, but you've never actually managed a digital product. Of course, you could learn it very quickly, but you're usually too busy dealing with a patient like caseload and stuff to do that. So I think sometimes it's a bit slower in some organizations to bring in that way of working because it's the transition to product management culture is disruptive. So the appetite is there, the interest is there, the recognition that it's needed is there. But then I should really stop talking about your book. It's just because you're right in front of me. But that's one of the things you talk about is like the tension of that and how that sort of organization starts to change. So yes, I don't know if that fully answered your question, but.
No, it did. It's always just staggering to me that we're so deeply, 38 years into the commercial web and the governmental use of the web. And, I always say, it takes 80 years to mature a technology. And so I know that, but I'm still sort of going like, can't we get it better, faster, sooner? Maybe, but I guess not. But anyhow, I'll stop hogging and step back for a second.
So you actually joined the city of New York just as the pandemic was hitting. And I'm just curious what it was like walking in to lead digital services in one of the hardest hit cities at a time when almost all of the services had to go to digital.
I probably can't speak in full to that. I can talk about a project. about one of the first projects that we worked on that's very much in the public domain, if that's helpful. So it's a project, I'll just tell you what it's about and you can tell me if you want me to elaborate. But one of the things we had to do really quickly is get 10,000 internet-connected tablets out to isolated older adults living in New York City housing authority buildings, and how you do that when you're fully remote and only like a couple of weeks into a job. So very happy to speak about that one.
Yeah,
let me know.
I think, sure. I think that's a fascinating topic, and just what does it look like to even plan that, right? From actually like the idea, the moment that you realize that something that had to be done, to actually following through and getting everything to execute on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined the city of New York. My first day of work was March 2020. Which was sort of the same day, basically, that everybody was being sent home. That was just like random timing. So I started work fully remotely and ended up working remotely for 17 months, like all of my colleagues. So it was a very, very difficult way to start a job, not because it was remote. I've started remote jobs before. I started for the Ontario Cabinet Office remotely, but obviously it was an extremely difficult time. And I think it's worth noting that there's the actual nature of the work that's challenging, but also this is an incredibly like globally traumatic experience, and nowhere was that more true than in New York in the spring of 2020. So it was difficult to come into an organization where everyone collectively is sort of living through something horrific. However, being a digital team, we're very sort of well equipped to be flexible. And so one of the first projects that we worked on was getting these 10,000 internet-connected tablets to isolated older adults who were living in New York City housing authority buildings. And so when you think about a service design challenge like that, is one of the most, I will continue to use this for many years as like an example of end-to-end service design, because you're talking about the product itself being shipped, you're talking about the unboxing experience, you're talking about having to provide multilingual support, and all of these things. And so what we ended up doing was, the way in which we operated the team would be very familiar to anyone who's worked on a product team. We had a product manager who was trying to keep all of this on track. Of course, we were working with partners across the city of New York. So the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, working with Department for the Aging to help us identify who the folks would be, working with T-Mobile, who was the work providing, they were the people who were shipping and kitting all the devices. But basically what we had to do is come together and quickly do an end-to-end experience map of like, what is every touch point here? And one of the challenges was we were moving so quickly that we didn't necessarily know the digital literacy of the person. And we knew it was fairly low, but we didn't know if it has never used a tablet ever or has some experience. And the second thing we didn't know is what language they spoke. So what we ended up doing was sort of building the most accessible possible service we could do. So when the devices were kitted, it didn't look like a tablet would normally look out of the box. We actually had changed the interface. We had very, very few icons. So we used a lot of negative space. And we had these print materials that were quite beautiful that we had included, packaged into the boxes, so that the sort of basic overall service flow was a person would get a robocall and they could opt in and consent. People always forget about consent in these processes, but we need to be able to get their address and share their address. So we need them to consent to share their address and that they want a tablet. Then once we have those addresses, we start kitting the device and making sure that everything that's boxed in has, beautiful and simple instructions, stickers on the devices in case they lose the instructions, that the SIM cards are already in the device, that we've had them kitted so that they don't have to go through all the T's and C's. We had that sort of in a separate sort of user experience pathway. And that when they got these devices, all they had to do was press one button, and that would actually load to a website that we were tracking in terms of analytics, so we could help to see what people are looking at. Are they turning on the devices? But also that would walk them through how a tablet works and where to call for help. And, we did this whole thing over the period of like 3 or 4 weeks. And then as part of doing this, we're also calling older adults and trying to do this user research as we go, but moving very, very, very quickly. So it was a really challenging, but really rewarding project. We had consent to share some of the quotes from the people who received the tablets. And it was amazing to see, not only with the people who were working at all hours trying to get these tablets out fast enough, to help them see the impact of the work. Like, this is why you stay up till all hours to kit these devices or to make it as perfect as it can be. But also to hear that like people were using these tablets to connect with their cardiologist online or connecting with their grandchild online, and that was that point of connection. It was I think it was among my favorite projects that I've ever worked on, although it was very challenging. And then the final thing is like behind the scenes, seeing how we were able to use tech in a sensible way. I mentioned that we were sort of tracking what people were using on this specialized website we made for this app. But also we had some live dashboards where we were looking at, how many devices had been shipped, how many are in transport, how many had been received. And this was sort of our like central virtual HQ, where anyone working on this project could see the status of anything at any given point, because we were moving so fast. We just needed to have this sort of single point of truth. So that is what it felt like to be working at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in the city of New York. It was all hands on deck, and there was a lot of collaboration. But I'd say my favorite quote from that project was actually the woman who described using the tablet to listen to music from her youth that she hadn't been able to hear in decades on YouTube, and dancing around her apartment listening to this. And you're like, if you're isolated at home during...
Oh, that's beautiful.
Isn't it? And it brings this whole thing to mind. It was amazing. And actually, just as a random aside, I've never had this happen, but as I mentioned, we had consent to share addresses and consent to share details of a quote like that. And actually, the mayor of New York read out a bunch of the quotes coming out of this initiative, because they were so... they just gave you such a powerful mental image. So that was cool for that project, but also cool for advancing, the user research practice within the city, because I think it really shone a light on why it's so important to speak to real humans.
That's awesome. I can't even imagine what the hypotheses were when you first started to like, we're going to do this, and these are the things that we want to learn from it, or these are the ways we want to help people. And then seeing how many different use cases arose from what you did. Like, aside from that powerful quote, what are some of the other like surprises or maybe confirmations about people's behaviors that you ended up with coming out of that project?
I think the biggest surprise was under the theme of, so if you have bought something or you're expecting something that you're in the mail, I would say for myself personally, like I'm anxiously awaiting it. Like if I get a notification from the shipping provider, I'm like, oh, it's only 2 days away, or it's coming this afternoon. I'm excited. One of the things that happened with this project is there were these like occasional moments where we're like, have the tablets arrived? Like it says it's arrived, but we don't see it hasn't been turned on yet. And we were sort of a little bit confused. And then as we started doing the user research, the evaluative user research, some people were saying like, oh yeah, it's arrived, but I haven't turned it on yet. And we're like, but it arrived 2 days ago. They're like, I'm going to turn it on the weekend. And today it's Wednesday. And it was such a different, it's just different. So I'd say that was the biggest
patience.
Yeah, something that I do not have.
I guess not all old people, but yeah, yeah.
So I think that was
maybe
surprising.
They were looking forward to it in a different way. They were waiting to have that special moment where they could sit down and really focus on it, right?
Yeah, that, and I think also one older adult was using it to participate in a gaming experience with their grandchild. And I was like, that's actually pretty cool. I'm not exactly sure how all the onboarding to that game happened, but yeah, I mean, I think we all have expectations about how different people use technology, but the gaming one was, I think, one of the cooler stories to hear as a way of connecting with the grandchild, I mean.
That's funny because, that when I'm listening to you talk and I'm thinking about how, and I guess I can't bring one top of mind right now. Maybe I will as I blather on. But there's so many things because of the pandemic, that uses of technology, people having to work from home if they were able to do so. Some people were just flat out unemployed. But there's so many things that I think people will carry forward. Things that were forced upon them. And when you talk about these tablets and you talk about technology in general in the pandemic, what are some of the things that maybe your teams learned, or you think just, municipalities, governments at the federal, whatever level have learned that they might carry forward like good practices that were forced on you. Like you're talking about all of this experience and this experience design for folks that sounds really stellar, right? And you did it really fast and you did it really well. What are some other things that you think might have come up during the pandemic that will be carried forward?
Yeah, I think on the whole, for a long time, many governments viewed digital as an extension of sort of just social media. So they'd think like, oh, when you talk about digital, you mean the people who run the Twitter accounts and maybe the website for the thing, whatever the thing is. And so for many years, there's been a slow momentum of like depending, usually it's, the early adopters who started thinking differently were those organizations often who had a transactional service. Whereas if your service is more knowledge-based or behind the scenes, then it might truly be that your digital presence really is just sort of social media and web content. But what I think maybe has been accelerated over the last 2 years is amongst those in any jurisdiction where they have transactional services, recognizing that it's not as though on one hand, and people cannot see me gesturing to the left, that you have the service and then gesturing to the right and you have this tech thing, that actually they're an embedded thing. That has historically not been the case. More progressive governments like gov.uk, I don't know if they still do this, but they had this idea that at the top of the pyramid, you have the service manager, and the service manager owns all channels. So why that becomes important, this is going to be very pedantic, this example, but if you have a multi-channel experience where, a person could be completing a paper form or they could be doing it online, one of the problems were that you wouldn't have an identical, it'd be potentially a set of different questions. It would be so disjointed. And so the digital teams would be trying to make a modern digital experience, except ultimately one would need to change the printed form. And historically, one of the things you'd see happening is the person who owned the printed form would be like, no, it's my printed form. Nothing should change. And then tension ensues. And so I think, and that's where that service manager role came in. So I think that has been accelerated, this recognition that it's not that you design the service first and then you think about how there might be a digital component, starting to integrate some of that. That's certainly not universally true. I mean, I hear anecdotes from some colleagues in other governments, and actually Amanda Clark, who's an academic out of, I'm not going to remember which Canadian university she's with, but she's written a really great paper about the Canadian context, which actually makes the opposite argument that I'm making, which basically says, we thought this would accelerate change, but in the context that she was looking at, what happened was stopgap measures that are slowly being rolled back to the status quo. So some of her argument was maybe we aren't moving as forward as much as we think we are. So that's an interesting article for those people. It's in Policy Options, I think is where it's printed. It's publicly available. So there is some of that, but I think on the whole, what I'm seeing is folks beginning to see how the digital component has to be integrated within the broader service as a whole. And then those governments that are successful at that are those that are really thinking about the sort of product management culture that they're bringing into that. Because in my opinion, it's exceedingly difficult or perhaps even impossible to make that transition without that heavy product management approach. I just don't think there's a elegant way to solve that.
Yeah, it's challenging. Yeah, I'm sorry. The last I'm going to tag and then I'll stop talking, Andy, is, the thing that people forget, I'm listening to you to talk, is, that form that people, version 72.5/9, 1972, 72.9 whatever, 1986, whatever, that form that people have been filling out forever that exists, the organization forms itself around the development of that form.
Yeah.
So we're always talking about service design and the citizen, service design and the consumer, service design and the user. And generally what I'm looking at is how hardened org structures are around the product themselves, right? And that honestly is harder to crack. That's the problem. That's the I want my face on the homepage. That's the we can't consolidate these websites into one. It's not because it's so hard to do. Yes, there are some challenges. It's not that. It's that the organization and all of its power structure is hardened around that artifact. And so that's just, what you're saying is just making that kind of blink out in front of me even more. That's really, really hard because that's people.
And sometimes it's also as simple as what is an assumed thing becomes entrenched. And then when one questions it, I call it the urban legends, where someone's like, oh, we can't do it. There's a policy against that. And then that's one of the onboarding tips you give people in digital government is it might be that there's a policy, but find the policy, because more often than not, there's no policy. It's just that someone has said...
like Tim always did it like that. Yeah.
Or a fascinating one in Canada is... with user research, it used to be there was a time where some jurisdictions would say like, oh, we can't do that. We can't talk to citizens. There's like a policy against this. And so we all went hunting to be like, what? There's a policy against this? And the hypothesis that I have, I cannot prove or disprove this, but my theory is, some of us sort of jointly came to this conclusion, is what people might be remembering is that before we go into an election, it's true that you do get notifications if you're a government employee from the government to say, basically we put a pause on engagement with the public, and under no circumstance should you be engaging with the public. And the purpose of that, of course, is to protect the integrity of the election, because you don't want to be engaging with the public in any way that might accidentally somehow put one political candidate at an advantage over another. So it's true that you do get very forcefully worded messages saying like, stop for this period of time. And so our theory is that whenever this user research thing comes up and we get pushback in the Canadian context, that maybe what people are just honestly remembering is these emails that come out periodically around elections. And so in good faith, they're trying to say, no, we don't do this. And then you have to go through a whole exercise of reassuring people that, there's safe and appropriate ways to do this within government.
When it comes to creating digital services, there's a lot of teams that are involved, right? There's product teams, there's technology teams, there's design teams, there's research teams, there's legal teams, there's a million teams. When you talk end-to-end service design, just taking, a process and making it digital doesn't necessarily make it better. Sometimes it's like, how do we rework the entire workflow and the entire process? But yet organizations want this speed of like, let's just digitize the thing for now. And then we can always figure out how to make the process better. So when you are talking to other leaders, like what are some of the conversations? What are some of the trade-offs to make them see either through a human-centered lens and how that kind of goes against the speed that the organization wants this digital thing just created, or this digital version of something that never was digital before? Like, I just want to hear, because there's so many people are having these conversations, not just in government, but in pretty much anything today that hasn't made its way to digital. So anything you can share there is just so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great, I mentioned that in digital government, we often have stickers. It's such a weird convention, but we love it. So there's a set of stickers going around that I believe were made by Hannah Schenk over at New America to go along with her latest book, but maybe she just retweeted it. But basically, the stickers say something more elegant than what I'm about to say, but if you digitize a crummy process, you're just going to get a digitized crummy process. And so that's, I think, the sort of main thing about service design that actually, this is not what you asked, but I do want to add this, that I think sometimes surprises people when it's their first time working with service design or digital teams, is because they're expecting it to be like a one-for-one transition of like paper form equals digital form. And when we say, no, but actually, while we're in there, or like now that we're looking at this whole process, what we really ought to do is blah, 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 blah. And some folks in I think the nicest way are just not anticipating that. And they're like, whoa, no, please don't. I never asked you to touch those things. And that's where some of these tensions come up of, no, just digitize the thing, to which the service design people will say, if we just digitize the thing, we'll just have a crummy digital thing. So I think in terms of, what can we get quickly, and that trade-off of, substantially and robustly addressing the service design challenge, but also producing something that provides value as soon as possible to the users of that service. I think that's where we get into some of the things you'll see in like the rapid prototyping labs in government, or doing some of these sprints to explore, and using co-production and co-design in a sense as it's intended to exist, which is to say, bringing people on that journey to address some of that resistance to the concept of change, and doing that through having people participate in user research sessions. So by that, I mean, you have someone who owns a whole transaction of some sort, and having that person come in and watch the person, an everyday human, use that service and maybe have a frustrating experience, or use a prototype of what the new service could look like and just see how happy they are. And through bringing those decision makers into the process and helping them see what's happening in the digital factory, that actually is, in my opinion, the strongest, most powerful thing we can do to create change. I'm constantly getting executive people to come in and look and participate, even if it's just for 5 minutes, to watch a real user test. And that, I think, is the most powerful thing in combination with having those same people come to things like shows and tells. And so when I say show and tell, what I mean is if you're working in a I guess it doesn't have to be user-centered, but I'd hope it's a user-centered, agile, sprint-based product management culture. If you're doing, a show and tell every 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and having people see the progress and say like, hey, we've like 2% solved the problem. And the next time they come, oh, we've actually 6% solved the problem. And that these are increments of working product. That, I think, consistently helps people understand what it is we're trying to do, why user-centered design matters, why it's a good thing if we identify a problem in user testing and actually have to take 2 steps back before we take another 4 steps forward. Like, those are the tactics that, to your question of what do I see different digital government teams doing to address this, like that's what we're doing is making sure that people understand the process and get to feel included in how those decisions get made. I think that's the most powerful tool that we have, and it's very commonplace, I think, in many tech companies and increasingly more common in government teams.
We've talked a little bit about the impact of COVID, and that's a very specific thing, but just pushing that aside for a second, or integrating that in your answer, the impact of that in your answer. Where do you see this going? And you can speak as broadly or as narrowly as you want at the municipal level, at a national level. Where do you see service design in government going in the next, say, 20 years? Because we'd see that seems like a long time, but the UK thing was 20 years ago, right? So that time passes very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think in the digital government movements, plural, we're going to see different pockets going at different speeds. So I think those who've aligned themselves more with the UK approach, already you're seeing, the way you can sort of predict where it's going is who's hiring and what are the jobs. And so when you start to see that they're hiring, a group is hiring, 20 service designers or a head of product, and they're using the word product, not project. That's where you start to see it really changing. I think one of the big questions that remains is for the smaller governments, where they're never going to be able to have 50 product managers. It's not like the UK where, there are so many opportunities with gov.uk because of, and just to be clear, but because of the nature of how that's structured, right? It's a national service for, over 50 million. That's correct. Yeah. Over 50 million people. So there's like economies of scale there, but if you're in a small local municipality, it becomes really challenging. So I think in those instances, and this is a maybe unexpected answer, but you start to see some of the work coming out of Georgetown University about state software collaboratives. So the idea that if you're a small enough jurisdiction and you're solving a problem that's actually been solved by many other governments, because some things are just like every city does parking tickets, for instance. That's a thing. There are these ways in which some of these jurisdictions,
but that's okay.
There are these ways that different jurisdictions can sort of band together. And so I think that's also going to be more common, because the natural progression is that a jurisdiction thinks, oh, I want to advance in this way. And then they look around, they look at their headcount, they look at the size of their budgets, and they're just never going to be able to put together, their own team. And so, of course, you can still work with vendors, but there still needs to be ways to sort of produce these economies of scale. So I think that's going to be something we see more commonly. But then I think in those bigger jurisdictions, you'll start to see those larger government digital service style teams emerging where they have an in-house team of experts. And then what I'm hoping we'll also see is that product management becomes something that's owned not just in technology or digital teams, that anyone who's delivering any sort of service for humans thinks about how they want to manage that product, and that becomes they start to think of digital as a strategic asset. And historically in government, that's not always how it's viewed. It's
after the fact.
Yeah, or it's viewed as like the comms channel. But thinking of it, and I think the NHS.uk platform is one of the best examples of that. That is the single front door for health and care services. And then from there, you can get sort of triage to different things. But there's a clear path that they're trying to use to achieve a strategic outcome other than just having comms things. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more of that, because ultimately that is a very user-centered solution, that if it's 3 a.m. and your kid is screaming and you're trying to, because they're teething, and you're trying to just do this thing, that you can quickly do it on your mobile phone from your couch in your pajamas. That's sort of the end goal that we're trying to get towards. And so the more our leaders start to think about that, the closer we are to getting there.
So you're in a big city. What comes to mind when I say the word smart city?
Well, we just released a big strategy in the city of New York about IoT. So that's always the first thing that comes to mind is all of that stuff. I suggest that everyone read it. It's excellent. It's on our website. I can send you the link about it. But I think it's going to be a large area of growth, and it's exciting that...
that's the next 20, 30 years, right?
Yes, it's
50.
To quote Alex Bisker she's with NAVA at the moment, but she used to be at 18F. She likes to ask this provocation to clients, and she says, "Do you anticipate doing less digital work next year than this year?" And you have to think about it for a second, but it's such an interesting question, because is there any universe, and for a lot of these things, where people think there's going to be less of it next year? And of course, the follow-up is, when she's speaking to a client, is so then if the answer is you're going to do more, then what is it you are doing to help support the more doing? So for all of these things, I anticipate that it's going to be a sort of, it's exponential growth at this point.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting look at the future and what it could be. And, a digital or smart city, like Lisa mentioned, just what are some of the big challenges that prevent us from getting there, or that you anticipate that will be larger challenges for both large and small cities, but just even for the future that you just described?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Firstly, making sure that the jurisdiction has a very strong framework and has thought robustly about how to bring a digital rights and equity-based approach to that, because that's not necessarily the first thing that people think of, but you really have to consider that in your plan. And that's been something that New York has really focused on a lot, is thinking about how to bring issues of equity and inclusion to these types of technology considerations. I think the second thing is also that there's all of the new exciting things in the future, but there's also some of the foundational things we still need to talk about. So another joke in digital government is like, sometimes people get frustrated every time you're on a panel and they ask you about like the future of blockchain, because you're like, interesting question, not saying it's not important. Also, before we get excited about very, 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 very future things, there's also a series of more immediate things to consider.
Can I pay my parking ticket?
Yeah. So, but I think what's nice about New York specifically is that we're able, at the moment, at least in our office, we've been able to sort of do some of that at the same time. So doing very practical, and if you read our IoT strategy, you can see some of the interesting things that we've done that are really here and now and practical and tangible, while also being that balance with being forward-looking. And then also there's some of us who have worked on some of these more foundational elements. So don't know if that fully answered your question.
No, it does. And, I've spent a lot of time both in healthcare and finance, and very similar to government. When people think of these things, they think of technology stacks that are very monolithic and outdated. And, the hope for the future is leveraging like API platforms and more modern technologies. So What are some of the things that need to be done for companies or governments to change that perception, to give people a little more trust in the technology and especially around data?
Trust in government systems, you mean?
Yes.
Well, I think being able to communicate to people about how their data is being used, or helping people to understand what it is that is actually happening, is critical, because sometimes I think it's a lack of clarity that folks are responding to. So being able to say, this is your data, this is what you're consenting to, this is what you're opting in and out of. In some ways, it becomes a boring design question when you look at just the opt-in language that we use on a government thing about where your data is going and how it's being used, and asking yourself, is this language actually, I'm sure it's legally valid, but is it also going to make sense to an everyday user when they read that? So I think probably one of the biggest areas is making sure that an everyday person who is processing lots of information and probably isn't waking up every morning and looking on the government website to say, like, hey, what's new with my government today? There are those people, they are awesome, but they're not the majority of users. So thinking about when we have that opportunity to engage with people, how can we make sure that we build trust by communicating in a way and having a visual language and also written language that's clear and helps people make sense of things. Because I think where the distrust comes in often is sometimes when people aren't able to discern something, or the fragmented nature of something doesn't convey a feeling of trust. And so I recall I worked on a UK tool at one point where it was so fractured that you honestly, even as a digital professional, you looked at the actual experience and you actually couldn't tell if it was still the same government journey. Like it switched at some point. And even as someone who was aware of the service, I thought, my goodness, my first thought would be, you've now somehow got onto some sort of spam site, when actually it's the same tool, or it's the same process. So I mention that because it's like, that's where, to come full circle to some of the things we started talking about at the initial outset of this discussion about why sometimes having that consistent branding or that consistent look and feel, or having patterns that seem familiar, that familiarity, that brand recognition is actually part of the trust that I think lays that foundation, so that as we do other types of experiences, or there's other more complicated things we do, that people have a little bit more understanding of what it is that we're talking about. Because if not, the disjointedness or the lack of clarity, I think, is partly where people get confused, or they're not able to discern sort of what's the fact and what's unknown.
Katherine, it's been great talking to you. Just to be respectful of your time, the things you're doing in the city of New York are super fascinating. How can people stay in touch with what you're doing and you in general?
Oh, well, you could follow me on Twitter if you wanted to see what is 99% digital government related tweets. And so you can find me.
What's the other 1%?
Something that made me laugh. Anything, okay. Whatever it is, if it made me laugh out loud, retweet. So I'll share my Twitter handle with you all. It's @ and then Ms. Katie Benjamin. But otherwise, we keep our nyc.gov/CTO website very up to date. So we have lots of ways to get involved. And if you're actually in New York at the moment, there are some outdoor events that people can attend. So if there's anything that's safe and socially distant, we do talk about that on our website. But otherwise, all of these amazing either publications or things that we've done about things like our AI primer or IoT strategy and other things, they're all there. You can read them on our website.
Well,
Awesome.
Probably by the time this airs, it'll be fewer outdoor activities. Are they still doing ice skating? Are they still doing? Is that going to happen this year? The outdoor rinks? I lived in New York for 10 years, and my son was born in New York, so there are things to do in the winter outside.
That's true. I don't know if there's ice skating. If there is, I would like to do it. It's sort of on my bucket list, having only just got to New York. But I don't know.
That's right. You've been in New York all this time and done nothing.
So definitely no ice skating in July.
Yeah, there you go. Well, we would hope not.
Yeah.
Anyhow, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy surfacing, please rate, review, and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/surfacingpodcast. If you have suggestions for guests or a topic you'd like to hear about on Surfacing, please reach out via the contact form found at surfacingpodcast.com.